Hi, welcome to Give Me the Bible, where God's Word speaks for itself. We're in Romans 10, continuing our study of this section from Romans 9 to 11, where the Jews have a problem with the Lord. They think He's being unfaithful to them because He's allowing some of them, maybe even many of them, to be lost because of their rejection of Jesus Christ. And Paul's trying to show them in these 3 chapters, that's not true. God has not been unfaithful. God has been very faithful. And in fact, the last thing we talked about in Romans 10, verses 5 through 13, was that God has made salvation attainable to the Jews. That the Jews really have no excuse for not being saved because God has not made salvation impossible. He's made it very attainable by faith. If they just put their faith in Jesus, follow Him by faith, it's not something they have to earn by their own good merits or their own perfect performance. It's always been by faith. And that was true under the Old Covenant, and that is true now in the New under Jesus. And Paul kind of picks up that discussion in Romans 10, and we're going to cover in this video verses 14 through 17, where Paul's really saying God has done everything in His power to make salvation attainable to you, including sending preachers out into the world to proclaim this gospel message. You know, it's just like on Mount Sinai in the Old Covenant, when God comes down to the people, gives them this law through Moses. Well, now God is sending His word out through the inspired apostles and prophets. And so again, for the Jews, salvation is right in front of them. They have the word of the gospel about Jesus Christ right in front of them. So there's really no excuse for them to be lost. They can't blame God that they will be lost because God has done everything He can to put salvation right in their lap. So let's just start in verse 14 and 15, because I just think this is so powerful what Paul does here. I love how Paul uses the Old Testament throughout Romans. It is just so powerful in so many ways. Look what he says, verses 14 and 15. How then will they call on Him in whom they have not believed? And how will they believe in Him whom they have not heard? And how will they hear without a preacher? And how will they preach unless they are sent? Just as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news of good things. So God recognizes, okay, He wants the Jews to call on Him for salvation, but He knows that they can't really call on Him for salvation unless they have faith in Him, and specifically in Jesus. And He knows, well, how are they going to have faith in Jesus unless somebody goes and preaches Jesus to them? And how will they have somebody preach Jesus to them unless I send them? So it's kind of a reverse engineered logical deconstruction of what God understands. Like, okay, if I'm going to ask the Jews to do this, if I'm going to ask the Jews to put their faith in Jesus, well, I'm going to have to give them what they need in order to do that. That means I'm going to have to send preachers to teach them about Jesus and who He is and what He's done for them so that they can have faith in me, so that they can then call on me for salvation like Joel prophesied in Joel 2, which he mentions back in verse 13. So here's the thing. Paul now quotes from Isaiah 52 when he says in verse 15, just as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news of good things. I want us to go back to Isaiah 52 because I think it'll really help us appreciate the power in what Paul is doing here with his argument. In Isaiah 52, this is part of a larger section in Isaiah about God comforting His people, God saving His people. His people have been through a lot. They're in Babylonian captivity now. You know, they've been taken captive, if you think about it, by the Egyptians, earlier in their history, and then the Assyrians, and now the Babylonians. And Isaiah 52 kind of opens with God lamenting the fact that His people have so often been taken captive by these other Gentile nations. And because of that, God's name has been blasphemed among the Gentiles. If you think about it, the Gentiles, for them, it was, if we capture the Israelites, well, that means that our gods are superior to the one true God. And it means that, the one true God, in quotes, that the Israelites were claiming to serve, well, He wasn't strong enough to protect them. He wasn't powerful enough, or maybe He wasn't faithful enough to honor His agreement with them to protect them. And so God's name got dragged through the mud because of all of these captivities. And so here's what God says about that in Isaiah 52. Look in verse 5. Now therefore, what do I have here, declares the Lord, seeing that my people have been taken away without cause? Again, the Lord declares, those who rule over them howl, and my name is continually blasphemed all day long. Therefore, my people shall know my name. Therefore, in that day, I am the one who is speaking. Here I am. So a couple really cool things going on there. One, he's saying, okay, all the nations are blaspheming my name, but I'm going to make sure that my people know my real name. I'm going to make sure my people know exactly who I am, that I am not to be blasphemed, that I am not too weak to take care of my people, because I'm going to step in and do something about it. And he says, in that day, I'm the one who is speaking, here I am. So there's a couple layers of meaning there, I think, that are important. One, he's basically saying, I'm going to present myself to the people. I'm going to come and say, I'm here. Here I am. Which, if you kind of think about it as a foreshadowing of what he's going to do in Jesus, when Jesus comes on the scene, that's God in the flesh. And his name, he's called Emmanuel, God with us, right? When God comes in the form of Jesus, he's going to say, here I am. And the other cool thing about that is, if you remember at the very beginning of Isaiah, God commissions Isaiah, and he says, who will go and preach to these people? And Isaiah says, here am I, send me. Well, here God's saying, in that day, in the day that I save my people, I'm going to send myself, right? I'm going. Here am I, send me, is God's attitude. And notice what's associated with that. Verse 7. This will sound familiar to you now. Verse 7. How lovely on the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who announces peace and brings good news of happiness, who announces salvation and says to Zion, your God reigns. Zion was the hill upon which Jerusalem was built, and it kind of became synonymous with the people of God in this kind of elevated state and status. And so God says to his people, your God reigns now. That is the good news that's coming, is that God reigns as king. That's really what the gospel means, by the way, the good news that Jesus is king. And this is all foreshadowing that. And you say, well, Brian, he's not really, doesn't seem to be talking about Jesus here. He seems to be talking about saving his people from Babylonian captivity. Well, that's true in the immediate context, but continue reading. He says, verse 8, listen, your watchmen lift up their voices. They shout joyfully together, for they will see with their own eyes when the Lord restores Zion. Break forth, shout joyfully together, you waste places of Jerusalem, for the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm in the sight of all the nations, that all the ends of the earth may see the salvation of our God. So it seems like there's something a little bit more grand behind Isaiah's language here than just God rescuing Israel from Babylonian captivity. That's true. He's going to redeem his people. He's going to bring them back from captivity. But when you read the rest of their history, I mean, it's not that great. Like, the temple's not as good as it was under Solomon's, and they still have enemies, and they're still not really fully at peace, even though they try to restore the law and things still aren't right. And what Isaiah is prophesying is a day that's coming where God's salvation will be seen throughout the ends of the earth. And it's neat. He says God's going to bear his arm. It's this idea of showing his strength. Everybody's going to see that God is strong enough to deliver his people. And here's the most fascinating part about this. This is connected with the work God is going to do through his servant. In Isaiah 52, he says, verse 13, behold, my servant will prosper. He will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted. Just as many were astonished at you, my people, so his appearance was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. Thus he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths on account of him. For what had not been told them they will see, and what they had not heard they will understand. So God's saying, actually, I'm going to bear my strength, and I'm going to show my strength through my servant. And the servant is a theme throughout Isaiah that is a bit mysterious, because sometimes it sounds like Isaiah is talking about himself as the servant. Sometimes it sounds like he's talking about the nation of Israel as the servant, or the faithful remnant from Israel. But it also sounds like he's talking about somebody else that doesn't really fit any of those other categories. And that's especially true when you continue reading in Isaiah 53. And it talks about this servant who will suffer for the sins of the people. He already mentions something interesting about the servant in Isaiah 52:15, that he'll sprinkle many nations. This idea of, it goes back to the priesthood sprinkling people clean from their sins. Well, he gets a little bit more detailed in Isaiah 53. Look at verse 4. He says, "Surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried, yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was pierced through for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The chastening for our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. All of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, but the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him." Now, in hindsight, reading the New Testament, we realize this is talking about Jesus. This is what God accomplished through his suffering servant. And so God is actually prophesying in Isaiah 52 that he is going to save his people. He's going to redeem his people and show his strength, bear his arm, by sending them a suffering servant who will die for their sins. Now, here's the amazing thing, and we'll go right back to Romans, because I think all this will click into place when I say this. Oftentimes, we're very familiar with Isaiah 53. We know all about the suffering, and he's despised by men, and he doesn't really look like much, and he gets buried, he dies a criminal's death, and gets buried in a rich man's tomb, and all that is very familiar to us. But what might not be familiar to us is how this chapter starts. Look in Isaiah 53, verse 1. "Who has believed our message? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?" So Isaiah is prophesying that God's going to redeem his people through this suffering servant. But who's going to actually believe that? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? In other words, who is actually going to believe that the arm of the Lord, the strength of the Lord to deliver his people, is shown in this suffering, crucified criminal? Isaiah recognizes, God recognizes, this is going to be hard to believe. And a lot of people simply won't believe the report or the message about Jesus. And this ties in exactly to the problem that Paul is dealing with in Romans 10. Go back to Romans 10. Look again now at the following verses. In Romans 10, again, he quotes from Isaiah 52, but now look in verse 16. He quotes from Isaiah 53:1, and he says, "However, they did not all heed the good news, for Isaiah says, 'Lord, who has believed our report?' So faith comes from hearing, and hearing from the word of Christ." God understands where faith in his Son has to start. It has to come from hearing the gospel message. That's why he sent preachers out, like Paul the Apostle, like the other apostles, to spread the gospel throughout the world so that people could come to saving faith in Jesus. But the problem is, not everybody is going to believe that message. Not everybody is going to believe that God's salvation, that God's strength is shown through a man who suffered and died on a cross. And that's what the Jews are stumbling over right now, that Paul is dealing with in Romans. They are not believing the message. So again, they may have a problem with God and accuse God of he's unfaithful because he's letting us be lost eternally. But Paul's trying to show them, no, God has done everything in his power to make salvation available to you, even making sure that he sent messengers out to proclaim good news that God is king, that Jesus is now reigning, and that the kingdom can be restored. The problem lies with you, Jews, the Jews that Paul's talking to. He's saying the problem lies with you in your unbelief. You are refusing to believe the message about the suffering servant. And if you just, there's hope for you. If you just start believing, if you start putting your faith in that message of Jesus and become a Jesus follower, you can still be saved. And that's what Paul wants for them. Earlier in Romans 10:1, he said, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is for their salvation. He loves his Jewish countrymen, wants them to be saved, but if they're going to be saved, they have to believe that message. And the same thing is true today of Jews and anybody else. Nobody can blame God for sending them to hell and say, oh, it's God's fault that I'm lost. No, God has done everything in his power to put the gospel message in front of you. He's doing that through this YouTube video right now. If you're hearing this for the first time, believe this message. Follow Jesus. Be baptized into him for the forgiveness of your sins. Walk with him daily so that you can be in heaven with him and with all the Jews who put their faith in him, and with all the other Gentiles who put their faith in him. Whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. I hope that is helpful and encouraging to you. And Lord willing, I'll see you next time.